He was, as you say, he's very abstract. He wrote a lot. When you read him now, it's a bit like reading Being and Nothingness by Jean-Paul Sartre or something like that. Not that I read the whole of that, but you sort of dip into it. It's like, wow, this is really it's quite sort of heavy going. It's not at all what you might expect from a monk, which would just be in our kind of caricature of medieval Christianity. We're just repeating the Gospels by any means, and he's very, very kind of syncretic, as he said, and brings in all this pagan philosophy, essentially Aristotle and the Greeks. But could you do us a quick biography, Oliver, first, so we can sort of place him?
Yeah,
we have the dates 1225 to 1274. So he died when he was nearly 60, and he was living in the middle of the 13th century.
And I think one of the key things to say about Aquinas is that he wasn't a monk, he was a friar. And friars look a lot like monks, but they're a radically new kind of religious order, religious movement. They retain some of the features of monastic life, in particular, living in community, singing divine office together, poverty, chastity, and obedience. But they move around, they walk between cities, and they're based really increasingly in the university cities where the ideas are and where the opinion formers of the day are. And so it's a new and controversial and radical form of life at the time. Wow. That Aquinas is joining. And his family, who were wealthy and had sent him to the Benedictine monastery of Monte Cassino for his education, would have expected him, I think, to become a monk, and were clearly not very happy that he intended to live the mendicant life of a friar. And this
the friars, the monks had been, so St. Francis kind of started the mendicant movement, is that right? Let's say, so before that, they've been sort of fairly static. So monks and friars are different, and the friar, like Friar Tuck, is allowed to sort of wander around. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say wander as such, but they're sent to where the need is. So a monk would make a vow of stability to a particular place. And is, as it were, sanctifying that place with their prayer and work and converting themselves to God in that place. Whereas friars are sent out to wander and to particular communities where they're needed. They're supposed to be useful.
Oh, okay.
Spreading of ideas. Yes, Francis got there just before Dominic. There's of course the probably apocryphal story of them meeting in Rome, and we think that probably it was made up by later storytellers to try and bridge the rivalry between the two orders, which had two very distinct visions of life. So yeah, Aquinas spent a lot of time in Monte Cassino as a child, a young man, and then moves to Naples to the university for further study. And I think the important thing about both of those locations, which are deeply formative for Aquinas, is that they're both on fault lines of frontiers. In Monte Cassino, the fault line is between two competing political authorities. It's a war going on. And Naples and the university there is the floodgates of foreign ideas, of pagan and Islamic philosophy. And in particular, the thought of Aristotle is flowing through there.
Well, Naples still feels very sort of Greek now, doesn't it? I mean, if you visit, we went a few years ago, and the place where I was staying, he said, well, we don't consider ourselves Italian, we consider ourselves Greek. And there's the Renaissance churches, and then below that is the Roman, and then underneath that there are still Greek remains.
Yeah, I've never been, so I have to take your word for it. But yeah, that sounds plausible. Yeah, so and one of the chapters in the book is called Frontier, and that's actually about being human. And it's a word that Aquinas uses to describe the human person. So yeah, I think he was somebody who knew diversity, who knew division, who knew poverty, famine, war, and many of those kind of scourges of political life that we know today. He died relatively young.
Sorry?
Sorry to cut you off, Tom.
No, just to continue with the biography. So I think he was basically sort of teenager in Naples at the university for years and years, quite young.
Yeah.
What's the story about his brothers sending two prostitutes to try and seduce him away from his vow of chastity?
Yeah, so this is when he decides to become a Dominican, members of his family kind of imprison him and send some, according to the story, send some prostitutes into the locked room with him to try and corrupt him. And he reacts in a very violent way against that. And it's clearly some kind of non-consensual sexual assault type situation, which seems to have traumatized the poor guy. And his views on the threat that that young women present to the young monk are rather stark, and I think it's born of this experience. Yes, whether that's been exaggerated or whether that's a sort of real telling of the story is a matter of debate, but I think the consensus is it's a version of reality.
But he persists in his path, obviously, and I think goes to Paris and joins the university there. What were the universities like then? They were fairly new.
They were
it must
new,
have been only a few.
they were exciting. But they were also, I think, stifling in some respects. I think we can come up with the idea that the universities were places where questions were entertained freely and a debate was allowed. And in actual fact, they were places of contest and conflict and much the same kind of academic politics as we might see today, except involving mass brawls, poisonings, the odd murder. The competition for control of the universities is probably the main thing that's going on. And among the things which is going on is, of course, the prohibition of teaching Aristotle. And Aquinas finds himself going against that kind of trend. Yeah.
So Mark was talking about the Averroists, Aristotelians. Could you flesh that out for us a little bit? So, I mean, I got a sketchy idea that you read that in the medieval period, translations of Aristotle came into the hands of Christians, people like Aquinas, via Arab translations. Was Averroes one of those translators? Could you just sort of explain all that to us?
Yeah, so he's one of a group of commentators that are particularly important for Aquinas. Averroes, Avicenna is one that Aquinas has more sympathy with, and Maimonides, a Jewish commentator. And so Aquinas is very, very rarely rude about his opponents. But one of the opponents that he is rude about are the Averroistas. Rather than Averroes himself, more the kind of followers of Averroes in his own time. And he seems to think these people are dangerously stupid. And dangerously stupid for a range of reasons. But among them, they think that we all share one common intellect and that we all have a kind of share in that common intellect. And I think for Aquinas, that really is an attack on the meaning of life and the joy and the experience of contemplation. And so it attacks every element of Aquinas's passionate quest for the truth and desire to see God face to face in eternity.
Now tell us about his breakdown in 1273, because that was well, that's actually quite near the end of his life, but there was some breakdown or mystical revelation of some kind.
Yeah, one of the things I sort of vaguely argue in the book is that it was actually both. Most likely both a burnout from overwork and also some kind of mystical experience. And I think that's often the way that people's lowest moment is the moment where they encounter the grace of God in a particularly acute way. Yeah, so I mean, Aquinas was overworked partly through his own faults and partly through the lack of charity of his superiors, and comes to a point where he doesn't feel he can continue writing, and he throws away his writing implements in a kind of dramatic flourish. But yeah, he has this encounter with something, and says that compared to what he has seen, it seems that everything he has written is straw.
So it's a bit like a kind of Tolstoyan moment. I keep reading about this moment in Tolstoy and his Confessions, or the Confession, when he's the most famous writer in the world. He's written War and Peace. He's rich. He's got everything he could possibly want, and he's like, it's all meaningless. What's the point?
Yeah. Well, I don't think that's quite what Aquinas is saying. I think what he's saying is something like, having labored to get to this point, now is the time to stop and enjoy. It's not that the writings need to be thrown away and burned, but that there's something that can be left behind once you've reached the point of arrival.
Well, let's talk about this idea of contemplation, because what I picked up a little bit from Aristotle's Ethics anyway, that he recommends the contemplative life as the one most likely to lead to some kind of fulfillment or happiness. And you talk about contemplation in Aquinas. Also, this idea that, which seems kind of quite alien to us, really. When faced with a problem, we would say, oh, we've got to try and solve that problem. We've got to work really, really hard. We've got to stay up all night. We've got to work, solve this problem. Aquinas had a different attitude to the world. Could you describe that? It was more about contemplation, whether he gets that from Aristotle or from Christianity, or some kind of mixture.
So the central argument of the book really is that for Aquinas, the fundamental mistake we make is to think of the world as if it were made up of blocks of inert stuff that we can move around. And I think for Aquinas, the beginning of wisdom is to realize that the world is alive, that it is energy saturated with God's love and God's self-communication. And so in order to understand the world, you can't just look at it. You need to listen. You need to be caught up with it. You need to be engaged with it. And therefore, his approach to knowledge and learning is one of, I think, a vast openness and attunement to what the world has to say to us, and then, and only then, speaking. So for Aquinas to exist as a human being is to belong to a world that speaks.